In the spring of 1940, something happened that changed what America decided to build. France fell in 6 weeks. The Wehrmacht's armored columns had sliced through what was supposed to be an impenetrable defensive line, and the world watched the most powerful army in continental Europe collapse in the time it takes to plan a summer. The lesson the United States drew was immediate and unambiguous. Modern war moved on tracks, and if America was going to fight it, America was going to need a tank, a lot of tanks, and it was going to need them fast. What emerged from that calculation was not Germany's answer and not Britain's answer. It was something else entirely. A machine designed not to be the best tank on any given battlefield, but to be built by the thousands, shipped across oceans, repaired by a 5-man crew with basic tools in a muddy field, and replaced overnight when it was lost. The M4 General Sherman, named by the British after the Union general who had burned path through Georgia, would become the most produced tank in American history, the backbone of every Western Allied armored force, and the subject of debate that still runs hot among military historians today. Was it a death trap? Was it a wonder weapon? The honest answer is that it was neither and both, and that the numbers tell the story better than any single verdict. When American ordnance designers accepted the Sherman prototype in October 1941, they made a deliberate set of choices. They chose speed and mobility over armor. They chose a hull that could be manufactured in 11 different factories by workers who had been building automobiles and locomotives the year before. They chose a main gun, a short-barreled 75mm that could handle most of what they expected to. Face, sized to fit inside a fully traversing turret rather than the side spunson mount of its predecessor. The tank that resulted weighed roughly 33 tons, carried a 5-man crew, could move at nearly 30 miles an hour on a road, and could be kept running in conditions that would have reduced a more complex machine to scrap. The Army assessed it against the German Panzer IV, the mainstay of the German armored force at the time, and concluded it was a match. That assessment would prove correct for about 2 years. After that, it would need to be revisited. The Sherman first went to war not in American hands, but in British ones. Churchill had appealed directly to Roosevelt after the disastrous British defeats in North Africa, and Roosevelt had responded by stripping newly issued tanks from American armored units and shipping them to Egypt on an emergency basis. By the time the Second Battle of El Alamein opened in October 1942, roughly 252 Shermans had reached the British Eighth Army. Against the German Panzer III's and Panzer IV's, and the Italian armor of the Afrika Korps, the Sherman performed well. Its 75mm gun could handle what it met. Its mechanical reliability was a revelation to crews who had been nursing temperamental British designs across the desert. Bernard Montgomery's army broke Rommel at El Alamein, and the Sherman was part of why. That debut was by any measure a success. The war, however, did not stand still. By 1943, the Germans were fielding the Panther and the Tiger. Both of those machines were, in a straight one-on-one engagement, dramatically superior to the Sherman. The Tiger I mounted an 88mm gun that could destroy a Sherman at ranges the Sherman's 75mm could not answer. Its frontal armor was thick enough that the standard Sherman gun could not penetrate it at any realistic combat distance. When a Sherman met a Tiger head-on, the result was usually not in the Sherman's favor. American tankers learned this in the grinding battles of Normandy in the summer of 1944, and they learned it at terrible cost. The numbers from the 3rd Armored Division have never lost their power to stop a reader cold. Belton Cooper, an ordnance officer who spent the European campaign recovering destroyed American armor, set them down plainly in his memoir. The 3rd Armored Division entered combat in Normandy with 232 Sherman tanks. By the end of the European campaign, 648 of their Shermans had been completely destroyed in combat, and another 700 had been knocked out, repaired, and returned to the fight. That is a loss rate of 580% of the starting number. The division had cycled through more than 4 times its original tank strength in combat, losses alone, and still it fought. Those figures are not a condemnation of the men who drove the Sherman, they are a testament to them. They fought in a machine they knew was outgunned and kept fighting. There was also the fire problem, and it cannot be glossed over. The early Sherman's ammunition was stowed in a way that made it dangerously vulnerable when the tank was penetrated. A hit that found the ammunition could turn the interior of the tank into inferno in seconds. British crews gave the tank a grim nickname, the Ronson, after the cigarette lighter brand, a reference to how readily it seemed to ignite. Polish crews called it something starker still, the burning grave. The flammability reputation, though partially exaggerated in later retellings, all tanks burn when penetrated hard enough. was grounded in a real and deadly early production flaw. Engineers solved it with what became known as wet stowage, repositioning the ammunition into liquid-filled compartments that dramatically reduced the chance of an ammunition fire even when the tank was hit. By early 1944, wet stowage Shermans were the standard. The fire rate fell sharply, the fix worked. But the men who died in the early Shermans before the fix arrived paid for that knowledge. The Army and its crews did not stop there. The gun problem drew the same engineering attention as the fire problem. The Sherman's short 75mm had been designed for infantry support, knocking out machine gun nests, strong points, half-tracks, and artillery. It was never intended as a tank killer against the heaviest German armor. By 1944, when Panthers and Tigers had become the standard threat in the hedgerow country of France and the winter killing ground of the Ardennes, that mismatch had become unsustainable. The answer was the 76mm M1 high-velocity gun, a long-barreled weapon that finally gave the Sherman a realistic chance of penetrating a Tiger from the front. The British went further still with their own solution, the Sherman Firefly, which mated the Sherman hull to Britain's excellent 17-pounder anti-tank gun, a weapon that the Germans quickly recognized as a mortal threat. German tankers learned to identify Fireflies by their longer barrels and targeted them first, which prompted Allied crews to paint the Firefly's barrel in a two-tone camouflage pattern to disguise it as a standard gun. The last major production variant, the M4A3E8, universally called the Easy 8, combined the 76mm gun with a new horizontal volute, spring suspension that gave it a smoother cross-country ride and better handling in mud and snow. By the final months of the war, the Sherman had evolved into something considerably more dangerous than the machine that had crossed the Channel in June 1944. The Sherman's crews did not wait passively for official upgrades. In the field, tankers and mechanics found their own answers to the armor problem. Sandbag layers appeared on Sherman hulls across Normandy, crews piling them against the sides and front in the hope of spoofing or absorbing shaped charge hits from German Panzerfaust infantry weapons. Patton, when he saw the practice, banned it. His technical experts had determined that sandbags actually increased the tank's vulnerability to some rounds and overloaded the suspension. His solution was more direct. He ordered extra steel plate, stripped from destroyed American and German vehicles, welded directly onto the front hulls of Shermans in his Third Army. The factory produced its own response in the form of the M4A3E2, the Jumbo, Sherman, which carried frontal armor so thick it actually exceeded the Tiger Eye's protection. The Jumbo was built in limited numbers and used to lead the most dangerous assaults, precise because it could take what other Shermans could not. In the Pacific, the Sherman found a different kind of war entirely. Not the open country tank duels of Normandy or the Ardennes, but the close quarters hell of island fighting, where the threat came not from Tigers but from Japanese fortifications, bunkers, and determined infantry. There, the Sherman's firepower against entrenched positions and its reliability in tropical conditions made it the most valuable armored vehicle American Marines and soldiers had. On Iwo Jima, on Okinawa, across the island hopping campaign, Shermans were essential. General George Patton watched the public debate about the Sherman's shortcomings with visible impatience. When American newspapers broke the story of tank inferiority in January 1945, with Hanson Baldwin writing about it in the New York Times, and the question reached Patton at a press conference in mid-March. Of that year, his position was direct. He wrote a letter to Lieutenant General Thomas T. Handy, the Army's Deputy Chief of Staff, that the War Department released to the American press. Patton acknowledged that a Tiger could destroy a Sherman in a head-on engagement. But, he wrote, the Sherman could usually attack from the rear and avoid a slugging match. And beyond that, the Sherman was, in his documented words, incomparably more reliable and long-lived, as well as easier to ship and handle, than the Tiger. Patton was not a man who softened inconvenient truths. His argument was not that the Sherman was a better tank in a duel. His argument was that the Sherman was a better instrument of the war America was fighting. And in that, the record bears him out. Because the war America was fighting was not a contest of individual machines. It was a contest of systems, of logistics, of reach, of replacement. And on those terms, the Sherman had no rival on the Western Front. When a Sherman was knocked out, another was available within hours. When a Tiger broke down, and Tigers broke down often, their complex mechanical systems demanding specialized tools and expertise that front line, units frequently lacked. It might sit disabled for days. The Wehrmacht's logistics were stretched across two fronts and a crumbling supply chain. The American system was the most robust the world had ever seen. Repair crews operated workshops just miles behind the fighting, recovering knocked-out tanks in darkness and returning them to the line before dawn. The German army, retreating on every front, had no equivalent luxury. Tanks that German crews abandoned with mechanical failures became permanent losses. Shermans that American cruisers abandoned in the same condition were back in the fight within a day. The Lend-Lease numbers add another dimension to what the Sherman was. Of the 49, 254 Shermans built in 11 American plants between 1942 and 1945, roughly 17, 181 went to Great Britain, approximately 34% of total production. The Soviet Union received approximately 4,065 Shermans through Lend-Lease. Soviet tankers who drove them across the Eastern Front noted the Sherman's reliability as a particular virtue. Free French armor, Canadian armored regiments, and Brazilian armored units also fielded the tank. By the final year of the war, the Sherman was not simply an American tank. It was the Allied tank, the common vehicle of an industrial coalition that Germany had no answer for. Germany's answer had been the Tiger, and the Tiger was, in its own terms, an astonishing machine. Its 88mm gun was among the deadliest tank weapons of the war. Its armor could absorb punishment that would have destroyed a lighter tank outright. German Tiger crews compiled kill ratios in individual engagements that are still studied in armor schools. But the Tiger was also a machine that Germany could only build 1,347 of across the entire war, in every theater, on every front. The King Tiger that followed added another 492. Together, all of Germany's heavy Tiger production, every chassis that came off the Henschel lines from 1942 to 1945, numbered fewer than 1,840 tanks. The Sherman outnumbered that combined total more than 26 to 1. It outnumbered Tiger I tanks alone by more than 36 to 1. By the time of the Battle of the Bulge in the winter of 1944, the number of Shermans in Europe alone exceeded total German tank production for the entire war. That is not a footnote, that is the war. What the Sherman ultimately represents is a strategic decision made correctly and a tactical reality that came with a brutal human cost that must be acknowledged alongside the strategic success. American planners chose to build a tank that could be manufactured at industrial scale, shipped across 2 oceans, maintained in the field, and replaced when lost. They chose not to wait for a heavier, more powerful design to mature. The M26 Pershing, a tank that would have been the Sherman's equal against the Tiger in a head-on fight, did not reach European combat in meaningful numbers until the final months of the war. The Pershing was the American tankers had wanted from 1943 onward. It arrived in 1945. In the gap between what tankers needed and what they had, they made the Sherman work through tactics, through numbers, through the combined arms doctrine that kept Shermans supported by artillery, air power, and infantry so that no Tiger crew could simply pick them apart at leisure. There is a tendency in popular history to reduce the Sherman to a simple verdict. Either it was a heroic workhorse that won the war, or it was a criminal failure that got men killed unnecessarily. Neither of those framings survives contact with the full record. The Sherman was a machine that its crews fought courageously in despite genuine and deadly shortcomings, that evolved through the war into something substantially more capable than it had begun, and that succeeded, not because it was the best tank on the battlefield, but because it was everywhere on the battlefield, supported by the greatest military-industrial system in the history of warfare. 49,234 of them, built in 41 months, shipped to every Allied army on every front. Germany built the Tiger to win individual battles. America built the Sherman to win the war. The final count makes clear which calculation was correct. The Tiger crews were formidable. The Sherman crews were relentless. And in the end, it was the relentless ones who drove through the gates of the Reich.